Welcome to the VHA Weekly Update, Episode 12. I'm Stuart McCullough, I'm the CEO of VHAA. Starting as always with the Industrial Roundup, and in particular with community health. Thank you to those members who have provided feedback so far with regards to the document that lists all the claims that have been made so far by VARPA with respect to allied health professionals. For those who haven't seen it, what we've done is we've taken the logs of claim that have been served so far and consolidated those into a single document. That document is available through the VHAA community app. If members are experiencing any difficulty whatsoever in terms of utilising the app, please contact VHAA. With respect to the hospital members, we have the next of our regional forums occurring this week. This time we're in Warrnambool on the 29th of March. We'll be returning to each of the regions also in September. We have the next of our bargaining meetings with the AMA with respect to doctors in training and specialists on the 30th of March. And this week we'll be finalising and distributing the HR/IR Managers Report ahead of next week's meeting with the Metropolitan HR and IR Managers. Also, just a belated note of thanks to those members who helped us settle the provisions for the allied health professionals back pay documents and the supporting materials. The contribution of members to helping us work through the details of that is greatly appreciated. That's it for this week's Industrial Update. Welcome to the VHAA Weekly Update, where we go in depth with a particular subject. Joining me this week is Principal Industrial Relations Advisor Tim Nagel. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Stuart. Good to be here.
Now, you know the drill from here. We have a subject that we need to reveal by lifting up and showing what the contents of the box are. Would you do the honours? This is a Kinder Surprise kind of subject, so you have an additional layer to peel back. So for those people who are listening rather than watching us, would you be good enough to describe what it is you see?
I see a tea bag and a box of tissues.
And that means our subject is?
Based on the clues, I'm not entirely sure.
So obviously tissues, we have tissues, and then we have a tea bag. And if we take the letter T away from tissues, what are we left with?
Issues?
Issues, indeed. And there are no greater issues than the fact of that clue. But moving on to the subject for this week, the implementation issues that arise from the nurses' agreement. Just as a quick recap, previously we had done a podcast with regards to the general overarching implementation issues. And so for those people who are looking for information about those general implementation issues, that material is still available from our website. But moving on to today's subject, the implementation issues that have been identified under the Nurses and Midwives Enterprise Agreement.
Yeah, so look, as you said, there's some general implementation issues that relate to the common clauses across enterprise agreements. But then there's also some specific to the nurses and midwives, which we're talking about today.
Now, if we move to the Nurses and Midwives Agreement and the kinds of implementation issues that arise, broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say that they fall into two distinct categories.
Yeah, there's those clauses about how the clause operates, so what's the entitlement, how does it work? And there's the second category of how do you administrate it. So everyone knows how it works, but just how do you administrate it?
So I guess we're talking about issues that require further support in terms of understanding what the entitlements are, and then we're talking about material that support, I guess, a consistent application of those entitlements.
That's right.
So just take us through the issues that have been identified as key implementation issues under this agreement.
Well, the first one's contained within the long service leave clause, and it's the new provision that addresses the continuous employment, the mixed full-time, part-time and casual employment clause. So this is, the purpose of this clause is to recognise the employment of casual registered nurses, where they have mixed employment of both permanent and also casual.
So this is a very discrete part of the long service leave clause. It's a new provision dealing with the recognition of service for those people who were casual but are becoming permanent employees.
That's right, yes.
So first of all, who does that provision not apply to?
So it only applies to casual registered nurses.
Not to enrolled nurses.
It doesn't apply to enrolled nurses or to permanent registered nurses. So if you've always been permanent and haven't had any period of casual employment, then this clause doesn't apply to you.
And there is no change to the application with regards to enrolled nurses?
No.
And from memory, casual enrolled nurses were never excluded
No,
from long service leave.
that's right.
And in terms of the issues that have been identified with respect to that clause, it's fair to say it's a hot topic at the moment. What are the outstanding issues that need to be clarified?
Yeah, so there's a range of issues that we're doing some work on at the moment, and we're developing an implementation or guidelines for that. So issues such as when is the clause backdated to? There's no date within the agreement itself, but there could be a circumstance where there is, by its operation, a backdating. So we're working through that issue at the moment. Also, does the recognition of the casual long service leave go across employers? So we know that under the Nurses and Midwives Agreement, the permanent employment does. But this particular sub-clause relies on the Victorian Long Service Leave Act, which just implies to single employers. So is there any interaction between the two? So that's another outstanding issue that we'll need to work through. And the next one is that what are the obligations on employers to maintain records for that casual service prior to the implementation of the agreement? So that's also another issue that we need to look at.
Well, it's interesting. The issue of records and the maintenance of records has already presented itself as a fairly significant issue. It's very difficult to say to someone that they should have kept records when at the time they had no obligation.
Yeah, and that sort of links into the backdating and all those sort of associated issues are sort of rolled up and together. So we tried to separate them out a little bit, but they're the main issues. From an administrative point of view as well, we've also got the clause now, your long service leave accrual occurs in two different speeds, if you will. So one is at the traditional, 6 months after 15 years, whilst the casual portion accrues at the lower rate, the state-based rate, which is the over 7 years. So with those two different accrual rates, there's some administration challenges that also need to be worked through.
And when you say working through, in practical terms, what does that working through mean?
So what we're doing is we're developing a guide that addresses those issues specifically, and we'll consult with our members about that, and also the other stakeholders, so the unions, for instance, just so that we can agree on a consistent approach to make sure that down the track there aren't local issues.
So from memory, I think we've got the first week of April, of course, is our next Metro meeting. It's also our next general overarching reference group, which will be looking at materials that we prepare for the purposes of long service leave. So that's next week, first week of April. And then we will be seeking feedback from a broader membership group.
That's right, yeah.
And once we've got that feedback, we'll go and speak to the union.
That's right.
In terms of other issues that arise, the other implementation issues besides long service leave, what are some of the other issues?
So the agreement has a fixed roster provision in it.
Which is of itself not a new idea.
No, so the previous agreement also had an opportunity for people to transfer to fixed rosters, but it didn't really give you a process or what the outcome of that process was. It said you have a fixed roster, but didn't say what that looked like. So the new agreement's actually got a process and an entitlement within it.
So I think one of the key things with regards to approaching any enterprise agreement is to step back from the words in the first instance and consider the purpose. What is the purpose of that provision?
So the purpose of this is to try and achieve a balance between employees' needs for certain circumstances and also employers' obligations for flexibility or requirements for flexibility.
I think it's worth drawing attention to the fact that there's a difference between having a fixed roster and fixed forever.
Yes.
That those are two different things. So something that is fixed at a point in time can be unfixed.
Yeah, so the provision enables either the employee or the employer to change those arrangements, and they've got a process to do that. And it's important also to note that the clause operates, it uses a test of a regular and systematic 6-month period, so where you can demonstrate that you've had that regular and systematic pattern.
Which is a very familiar set of words.
Yes, that's right. So you need to be able to demonstrate that. Then an employee can apply to the employer to have that fixed. And the requirement is that the employer won't unreasonably refuse. So there is still an opportunity to refuse that in certain circumstances, but you need to go through the process.
And it's always important to remember that these are not provisions that enable someone to take someone else's shifts.
No, that's right, yes.
And what's the process with regards to the implementation issue for fixed rosters from this point on?
So really it's about stepping out the administration, the process. and identifying any potential issues. So as we know that we went, the working groups or the HR directors identified this as a potential issue. So it's about stepping through those issues and outlining the process.
Is it fair to say that in terms of the implementation issues, that some are emerging as higher priorities than others?
Yeah, that's right, yes.
And so the idea will be simply to work through them one after the other in accordance with the priorities set by the relevant reference group.
Correct.
What are some of the other issues that form part of the implementation list?
So the new agreement has a comprehensive parental leave clause in it. And in terms of new entitlements, there aren't a lot of new entitlements within this clause. For instance, some of the new additions are the inclusion of a permanent care order as part of an adoption leave, so it categorises a permanent care order as adoption.
Now, in terms of permanent care orders, it's probably worth emphasising that the number of permanent care orders granted within Victoria is very low. I think at one point we were advised it was something about 8 within the state for all of last year or the year before. So it's a very small number, but it is trying to address a potential anomaly.
That's right, yes.
And it is a fairly long and complex clause. It does mean that all the answers should be within the agreement when people are looking to determine entitlements, but it is a bit of a challenging clause for people to work their way through.
So it is quite a complex clause, so we're reliant on our members to determine whether they need any supplementary material to help navigate that clause.
I think it'll be useful, particularly given that everybody has an interest in having a consistency of approach.
That's right. So as much consistency as we can is a good thing.
So we've also got the issue of the statewide classification committee, which is yet to convene.
Yeah, so we're working with the unions to set some dates to commence these processes, and we've got a date for later in April. So we'll be working through the establishment of that. We need a chairperson nominated and appointed. So that's the next step in the process. In the interim, we're relying on members to gather any of the classifications that they think aren't covered by the current agreement, so that we can use it once the process is up and running. We have that work to do.
I think that's one of the interesting provisions in that the purpose of that body is, in a sense, to create a degree of precedent that other people can rely on. In a sense, it's a living example of that idea of having sort of best practice guides or some sort of guidance that other people can utilise rather than reinventing the wheel.
Well, I mean, today was a good example where I was contacted by one of the members with a particular role that not only wasn't covered by the agreement, but also when they contacted other health services, there was a significant range of classifications being used for virtually the same role. So,
which has been our history.
Which has been exactly the history, which is exactly why this clause has come about.
And now an issue of particular relevance to our rural members for those health services that were named is the transition to an 8-8-10 roster. What's the progress been with regards to that matter?
So we've met with those employers that were in the first round. So we know that half the named employers that need to go to an 8-8-10 roster by the 1st of July, from memory, or the end of July.
Of this year?
Yep, of this year. We've met with. We've also produced a flowchart or a decision tree to try and navigate through the process to follow to implement that clause. And look, the progress has been great. The feedback from the members is that it's going quite smoothly. We'll repeat that process with the next group that need to implement it by June 2018, later on this year.
I guess one of the benefits with regards to that second group for July 2018 is that whatever we learn from this first round, we can utilise in the second round.
Well, that's true. I mean, we've got the flowchart already developed, so the tools are there.
There are a couple of provisions under the Nurses and Midwives Enterprise Agreement that require work to be done expressly during the life of the agreement, and the two that spring to mind concern the aged care staffing review and the community health classification review. Starting with the aged care one, what are the things that we'll be doing in that space?
So the aged care review is really about working through the staffing profiles used in the high care, low care distinction. We know from 2014 that distinction has become non-relevant. So it's about working through those staffing profiles to find a better approach. We've also got, on top of that, is the safe patient care review. So
there's some overlap, I should say.
Yeah, so there's a real key intersection, but that piece of work needs to occur, and whether that occurs as part of the Safe Patient Care Review, we're not sure yet, but that we need to be able to plan for that.
I think it's an important thing to recognise that both nurses and personal care workers have a valuable contribution to make.
They do, that's right.
And in terms of community health and the staffing classification issues for community health?
So this was we had a group of members who this was particularly relevant to. We talked to them during the EBA negotiations to see whether we could come up with a structure to put forward during the negotiations. We couldn't do that, unfortunately, so we've got this clause in the agreement to examine over the life of the agreement. It is one of those things that need to occur in a considered way. So we'll bring a group together to do that over the life of the agreement.
I think the key thing with regards to community health is the degree to which community health is changing as a result of things such as My Aged Care and NDIS, and whether or not that impacts on nursing and classifications and the like, but the business in which community health operates in is evolving quite rapidly.
Well, community health nursing is not intra-hospital.
And it's not all of what happens in a community health service.
We know that some community health centres may only have a handful of nurses, others have got more. So it's important that we ensure that the structure used in standalone community health centres is relevant to the community.
And contemporary, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Occupational health and safety is one of the issues on the list. We did do a session earlier with regards to that, but just to remind people who might be listening as to the key issues or the key actions, I guess, from the occupational health and safety obligations under the agreement.
Yeah, so I think we have spoken about this before. So just quickly, there's a provision in the agreement at clause 98 that requires the parties, and that's us, VHA, ANMF and the department, and also those invited to attend, to work through a number of industry-wide OH&S issues such as manual handling processes, OVA, bullying, education for ANUMs and NUMs, and also fatigue and self-rostering practices.
Which does bring us on to the issue of occupational violence, which we had talked about. There are some provisions in the agreement that go to occupational violence and the ability for ANMF to make requests, and I understand that ANMF will have written to many members requesting information about their plan to reduce and eliminate occupational violence.
And this is part of it about bringing it front of centre of mind, so it's about a facilitative clause as well to help discussions. So as we know, the clause requires an employer to have an action plan within 6 months of the agreement, and that action plan really looks at outlining the actions necessary to improve security. It also seeks to implement proactive measures to identify and address risk within the organisation. The other things it needs to do is ensure a reporting culture and mechanisms to assist in investigation, and also provide appropriate supports following workplace injuries or incidents.
I think one of the things that we were keen to ensure, once we were aware that those requests were being made, is to ensure that the subject of occupational violence is not being dealt with in a piecemeal fashion. There is provision under the Nurses Enterprise Agreement for an industry group which considers those sort of matters, and we, a few weeks ago, made a request to convene that industry group so that there is some sort of overarching and coordinated approach as opposed to that potentially hit and miss approach.
It's really important that it's coordinated, I think. I think this is a challenging area for the industry. And as an industry, we've got access to a wide range of experts in this area. So I think it is important to try and leverage off that central approach. I mean, what the clause does require is for employees in the development of that action plan to consult with staff and their unions. So that's part of the process. I mean, the action plan in itself relies on an assessment or risk assessment by the organisation. That leads into what the action plan actually contains. So it is very much dependent upon local factors. So it's important that remains the focus of that action plan is, one, what are the issues we're facing, what's the assessment, and then do an action plan around that.
So many members will have had an action plan that they've developed over a period of time. Probably the key thing for us to emphasise, those who don't have an action plan.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of those things that you've got 6 months to do, but because you need to do assessments and risk assessments and hazard identification processes, you really need to start sooner rather than later. I mean, a vast majority of employers would have already done this, our members, but those who haven't need to commence as soon as possible. And that's the other half of the clause as well, is about those with policies. So those with existing policies, there's also a process to follow in the agreement as well to ensure that they are consistent with the ANMF 10-point plan.
Which really represents the orthodoxy that's been established by health services already.
Exactly, yeah. It will be nothing new to people, and it's a common sense approach to OVA in terms of those points that are relevant.
So there was one point that you made with regards to those people who don't have a policy and the time frame from that. Now, from memory, I think that might be 3 months rather than 6.
So it's they've got 3 months to commence the process, that's right.
Which means having regard for the fact of the agreement coming into effect on the 23rd of December means now.
23rd of March, that's exactly right.
All right, terrific. Just in terms of some of the other items that people were seeking some clarification on in terms of implementation, superannuation.
So superannuation, and this is more an administrative one, we have had a couple of queries just in around whether the choice of fund just applies to the voluntary contributions that an employee may make. It applies to all of it, so the compulsory contribution as well as the voluntary contribution.
So there was no intention in terms of the choice of fund to limit that to the voluntary component?
No, that's right. But what has come up is just some of the administration around the choice of fund approach. And that's really just a how to do it sort of thing. Those bigger employers will no doubt have had experience with choice of fund. Potentially it's just the smaller organisations where it's not as familiar.
One of the things that I've taken out of the feedback from the HRIR managers is that where there are changes to practices under the agreement, then those subjects are good subjects to have as implementation issues. And one of the examples of that concerns higher duties and annual leave. Yeah,
so the new agreement contains a provision where people have conducted higher duties for greater than 3 months within a year, then they're entitled to a proportion of their annual leave at that high rate, which makes sense because, I mean, if you spend the majority of the year at a high rate of pay, it seems a bit odd that you would drop pay when you go on annual leave. And also you should be rewarded or recognised for that contribution you're making to the organisation. So that in itself creates just some issues in terms of how it operates. You know, what 12 months are we looking at? It needs to be the anniversary year where you're accruing annual leave. And also in how do you accrue two different rates within systems, which is more the administrative processes.
And I guess when we're talking about somebody who's been in higher duties for 3 months or more, we are really talking about the exception to the rule.
That's right, yes.
And in terms of things such as underpayment of wages, where we have a provision requiring payment, but we don't have a penalty for it.
No, so during the discussions, the EBA bargaining process, this was recognised as a particular issue in some areas, not all, but some areas, where through the error of the employer, there was an underpayment. So this is about, in those situations, recognising and correcting it within 24 hours. And more often than not, it's going to be where a person will work overtime. It'll be authorised on their timesheet, but it won't flow through payroll and be paid. So in those situations, it should be relatively easy to flag it and then pay it.
So it's something that we'll certainly be talking to people about, but notwithstanding that it doesn't include a penalty, and those penalty provisions that exist in other agreements are really products of a bygone era where everything was done manually and the scope for electronic banking wasn't there. But by the same token, where errors are not controversial and are identified, that there is a requirement to be, to use the term, I hate to use the term agile, but agile enough to correct those within a reasonable period of time, or as quickly as possible, really.
Well, and it could be significant for employees. where they don't receive the pay that they're expecting. I mean, people have commitments that they need to meet.
Well, it's an interesting thing to contrast. What might seem like an insignificant amount from the perspective of an employer might be extraordinarily significant for an employee.
Well, that's right, yeah.
And everybody's favourite subject, meal breaks on rosters. The long-standing provision that seemed to generate a degree of surprise when we drew attention to it during the EBA forums.
Yes, this is probably one of the clauses that is unexpectedly taking a lot of the limelight during the implementation process, given that it's existed for 20 years. I mean, but when this clause came in, that it's a different time, so there were paper-based rosters, for instance, and a different environment in which we're operating. Today's a little bit different. But there is still an obligation to include those meal breaks. So I know that yourself and some representatives from the AMF are doing a lot of work in how to apply this in the modern era in terms of the rostering systems.
So we've got a couple of major rostering programs, Rosteron and Kronos. We had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with one of the health services that uses Rosteron, and we've got another meeting this week. I think to continue those discussions and really determine something that gives effect to the intention of the clause in a way that's workable for people. We'll need to do something similar, I suspect, with regards to somebody who uses Kronos.
And really this clause is about making sure that people get their meal breaks. So the premise of the clause is that if you've got a set time, then you're more likely to take your meal break. And if you're not, then it can be recognised at the time.
So briefly, just some of the other final issues with regards to the implementation list for the nurses and midwives agreement. We have overtime, and particularly with respect to recall.
Yeah, it's interesting because the overtime clause hasn't changed that much. There's been a little bit of tinkering, but the majority of issues seem to be the interaction between the overtime and recall, 10-hour breaks and continuous shifts. So we'll do a guide for that that will outline the various scenarios and how it should be treated.
And Ruson?
So Ruson is an interesting thing. This is about an undergraduate employment model. So Ruson's standing for Registered Undergraduate Students of Nursing. This enables employers, if they want to, and they're not compelled to, if they want to introduce such a model, then it gives a process for doing that.
And obviously, in addition to that, we have SDPP issues.
Yeah, so the SDPP for all the agreements are very similar, but the different one in the nurses agreement is the nurse unit manager review. So that obviously will take a bit of time from our side and from the union side to work through. So really where we're looking to land on is a three-tiered approach to classifications of nurse unit managers, and that will occur over the life of the agreement being implemented in 2019.
So it's probably just worth emphasising that the reason that we're doing this implementation process and working through these implementation issues is really to establish a continuous process with respect to bargaining, whereby we're aware of what the issues are under agreements for the next time that we seek to negotiate.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of benefits for to be a continuous process. So as opposed to a flurry of activity, then it's stopping, and then a couple of years later picking it up again. If we do use that time in between to make things better or to examine what's not working, it's going to make for a better outcome in the next round as well.
Well, I'm mindful that soon the 31st of March will be upon us, which means that we're coming up to the first anniversary in terms of the wage increases under this agreement, which means that effectively we're 1/4 of the way through the process.
That's right.
Tim, I'd like to thank you for joining me today, and with that thought in mind, would you like a tissue?
Thank you.